Good morning. It's early when I record these. It's super early. So, excuse the sleep in my eyes, but I could not wait to get back into our story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Wroblewski. I've actually already got the Kleenex. I recommend you do the same because I think we're gonna need it, okay? So as you recall, Edgar just crossed onto his own property line after being away for a couple of months. And he left Babu and Tinder with Henry. And oh my gosh, can you imagine leaving two of your, really, those are his kids, leaving them to stay with someone else, although he realized what great trust he had in that friend he made. So let's go ahead and jump right in. This chapter is called Almondine. When she wasn't sleeping already, she lay in the shade and waited for sleep to return. In slumber, everything was as it once had been. When they were whole and he ran beside her, pink and small-limbed and clumsy. Those were nights when the timbers of the house had breathed for them and no sand had yet worked into her joints. No search for him was necessary. In her dreams, he was there, always, waving bachelor's buttons for her to smell, unearthing oddities that she required to dig from his clenched hands, for fear he had found some dangerous thing. Not so in the waking world, which held nothing but an endless search. All her life she had found whatever she had been asked to find, and there had only been one thing ever. Now he was truly lost, gone away, crossed into another world, perhaps some land unknown to her from which he could not return. The closet was as puzzled as she, the bed silent on the question. It was not out of the question that he had learned the secret of flight, and the window was not too small for him to pass through. There, sleeping on the bed at night, she would be the first to see when he returned. Old as she was. Gosh, I can't start crying right now. Old as she was, she still had questions to ask him, things to show him. She worried about him. She needed to find him, whole or changed, but no in any case, and she would taste the salt of his neck. She had learned in her life that time lived inside you. You are time. You breathe time. When she'd been young, she'd had an insatiable hunger for more of it, though she hadn't understood why. Now she held inside her a cacophony of times, and lately it drowned out the world. The apple tree was still nice to lie near, the peony for its scent also fine. When she walked through the woods, infrequently now, she picked her way along the path, making way for the boy inside to run along before her. It could be hard to choose the time outside over the time within. There was still work to do, of course. The young ones in the barn knew so little, and she had taught so many before. It hardly seemed worth trying when she asked, though she did. She slowed. The farm danced about her. The apple trees bickered with the wind, clasped limbs in union against it. Blackbirds and sparrows and chickadees and owls rimming their crowns. The garden cried out its green infant odor, its melange, the invention of deer, or now it seemed to her the other way around. The barn swung her fat shadow across the yard, holding it gently by dark wrists and letting it turn, stretch out in the evening upon the ground, but never slip. Faster it all revolved around her when she closed her eyes. Clouds rumbled across heaven, and she lay beneath, and in the passage of shadow and yellow sunlight, the house murmured secrets to the trunk, the traveler who listened for only so long before its devout empiricism forced it away in wide-eyed panic to test such ideas among its fellows. The maple tree held the wash up to the light in supplication and received bright flames, yellow jackets each day, its only reply. The mailbox stood soldierly by the road, capturing a man and releasing him again and again. Among them, the woman passed, oblivious to it all, leading the pups once more, though, through what they surely must already have learned. The foolish pups who made them all stop and watch. Such was their power. Almondine sat and watched them, and then somehow the boy would be sitting beside her, arm across her withers. The pups had so little time inside that they barely stayed attached to the ground, as it had been with her, she supposed. And then she turned her head and looked, and Edgar was missing all over again. Had he really been there? Had it only been some bit of time inside her? The answer mattered more and more, even as the power in her to find him ebbed. They'd shaped each other under the heat of some more brilliant sun, whose light had quietly passed from the world. The towering pines in the front yard knew it. They suffocated one night when an ocean mist drifted into the yard, though no one noticed but she. 3 days she lay beneath them, mourning. The squirrels, respectful of nothing, ransacked the carcasses. The nights grew darker. Here we go, friends. The nights grew darker, the stars distracted. She slept beside his bed because if nowhere else, he would return there. He had been tricking her. He had hidden so cleverly. What a reunion they would have when he stepped out of his hiding place. Oh, goodness. I hope I don't have to start again, because we gotta get through this. And I've read it twice before. So, okay. The greatest trick of all revealed by him, there all along and watching while she searched, all along. The thought was so startling. She rose and panted and shook her head. So many places worthy of another look, but empty, all of them, and all extracting their penalty in passive, blithe, unconcerned. And then mid-morning of a day, when the sky rang overhead, she reached a decision. She rose from her sleeping spot in the living room and the kitchen to set her long, soft jaw on the woman's leg and tried to make it clear she'd have to look elsewhere. Sorry. The woman stroked her absently, a hand familiar against her flanks and caressing behind her ears. Almondine was grateful for it. The door stood unlatched. She still had the strength to pull it open. She walked between the row of trees on the long slope of the orchard. I don't know that I'm going to have enough tissue, guys. And she waited near the topmost tree. Perhaps he traveled. Now she would too. From far away she heard the traveler coming. For as long as she could remember, they'd passed her yard, acquaintances of the truck, exchangers of the empirical, the factual, the mathematical, traders in unknowable quantities, longitudes and azimuths, secants and triangulations. She had thought them intruders when she was young, but learned to pay no attention to her alarm foolish. They were benign, careening about for reasons of their own. Unstealthy, broad, and stupid they were, but they saw a lot of the world. It was coming up the far side of the hill. Its cloud of dust filled the air between the trees. The glint of its front piece appeared, and she was not scared. One must try new things. Inside she held the image of him on that first morning. Awake in his mother's sleeping arms, she'd thought what had begun then would never end. Yet he'd been too long missing for things to be wholly right. Nothing new of him in the yard, nothing in the house, all of it forgetting. Slowly she could feel it, and one could last only so long separated from the essence. Oh, goodness, guys. Really? Did you tune in just to see me cry or hear me cry? It might be a lot. Okay, let's take a breath. Okay, I can do it. You can do it. A quest waited in those circumstances always. The traveler was almost there, and if this one thing knew nothing, she would ask the next, and one of them would know. She would ask the truck her question, but with silence it professed ignorance. It had not carried him lately, though it would not deny it had carried him many times before. She had never thought to ask the other travelers until that morning. The idea had come to her in a whisper. She stepped onto the sharp red gravel of the road, and she was very nearly not there at all, so deeply was she inside her own mind. There was a time in her when he had fallen from an apple tree, a tree she had just stepped away from. He landed with a thump on his back. A time in the winter when he had piled the snow on her face until the world had gone white, and she dug for his mittened hand. Inside her were countless mornings, watching his eyes flutter open as he woke. Above all, she recalled the language the two of them had invented. A language in which everything of importance could be said. She did not know how to ask the traveler what she needed to ask, nor what form its reply might take, but it was upon her now, angry and rushed, and it wouldn't be long before she knew the answer. A bloom of dust like a thundercloud chased down the hill. She stood broadside in the gravel and turned her head and asked her question. Asked if it had seen her boy, her essence, her soul. But if the traveler understood, it showed no sign. All right, the next chapter. Woo, we got through that one. It's amazing to think about how our pets see us. You know, that bond that you have with them. And oh my gosh, it's the last tissue. All right. Friends, we're going to do this. Let's make this happen. This is Edgar. They walked up through the mantle of the tree shadow stretching across the western field. Ahead, the red siding of the barn glowed phosphorescent in the mold sunlight. A pair of does sprang over the fence on the north side of the field. 2 leaps each, nonchalant, long sustained, falling earthward, only as an afterthought, and crashed through the hazel and sumac. The air was still and hot, and the hay rasped dryly at Edgar's legs. Stalks of wild corn dotted the field, leaving leaves frayed and bitten to the cane, and the Indian tobacco was brown and wilted from the heat, all of it brittle and rattling as if folded from sheets of cigarette paper. By the time Edgar reached the rock pile, Essay had already coursed the yard, whipping the kennel dogs into a frenzy. He perched on a rock and listened. Equal parts of longing and dread washed through him, but the sound of the dogs pleased him the way a lullaby might please an old man. He picked out their voices one by one and named them. From where he sat, he could see only the roof of the house hovering darkly over the yard. He waited for some human figure to appear, but there was only the flash of Essay's body, low and elongate, cutting through the grass as she made another round. He stood and walked the rest of the way. The house was dark. The impala sat parked in the grass. In the garden he could see the green tract of cucumber and pumpkin vines, and far back by the woods 6 sunflowers leaning bent-headed over it all. He peered through the living room window, hoping to see Almondine. Knowing all the while that she had been home, she would already have found some way to bolt from the house. When he entered the barn, the dogs braced their forepaws on the pen doors and greeted him with yodels and roars and howls. He went from pen to pen, letting them jump and claw his shirt, laughing at their mad dashes and play bows and rolls. He saved Pout, Finch, and Opal and Umbra for last. Yikes. He knelt and mouthed their names into their ears, and they washed his face with their tongues. When they had quieted, he found a coffee can and dished kibble into a pile for Essay. She started eating daintily and then leaned into it as if suddenly remembering food. 2 pups, Goodness. 2 pups greeted him in the nursery. Just 2, from the litter of 8, whelped before he left. They were weaned and fat, shaking their bellies and beating their tails. He squatted and scratched their chins. What did they name you? Where are the others? He walked to the workshop. He looked at the file cabinets and the books arranged atop the new Webster Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language. Weighed so little in his hands. The scent of its pages like road dust. He leaned against the wall and thought of his grandfather and of Brooke's never-ending admonitions, and he thought of Hachiko. Among the mishmash of correspondence, he found the letter from Tokyo and withdrew the crumpled photograph he had hidden there. He looked at Claude and Forte through the webwork of cracks in the emulsion, then slid it into his pocket. He closed up the kennel, walked to the house. The kitchen door key hung from a nail in the basement. He ate straight from the refrigerator, fog pouring over his feet, bread and cheese and roast chicken off the bone, and then he walked through the house cradling a 5-quart bucket of vanilla ice cream under his arm, spooning it up and looking around. The kitchen clock, the stove, the candlelight light, the living room furniture sitting petrified and ogre-like in the dusk, the clothes hanging in his mother's closet. He walked up the stairs and sat on his bed. A puff of dust lifted into the air. Across the plank flooring, dead flies lay scattered, dry husks, blue and green, with cellophaned wings. He hadn't imagined everyone would be gone. He hadn't imagined saying hello to the place before seeing his mother, before seeing Almondine most of all. He had imagined sleeping in that bed again, but looking at it now, he didn't know how he could. He put the ice cream back in the freezer and dropped the spoon into the sink. Essay scratched at the porch door, and he walked out and pushed the door open and let her trot through the house, repeating his inspection. He was seated at the table at his father's place when she returned. He sat for a long time waiting. It was hard for him not to think about what things would be like, and finally he decided to wash up. When he lifted his face from the towel in the bathroom, he saw the green soap turtle sitting on the windowsill, complete and perfect except for one shriveled hind foot. He walked into the kitchen and found a pencil and a scrap of paper and touched the lead to the paper and stopped and looked out the kitchen windows. The windows had been propped open on sticks on a night breeze. Hot as an animal exhalation ruffled the gingham curtains. Dark, ripe apples swung from the branches outside the window. He put the pencil to the paper again. "I ate while you were gone," he wrote. "I'll come back tomorrow." Then he took the photograph of Claude and Forte from his pocket and set it beside the note. He gave Essay the option of staying or coming along. She walked down the steps, calm now, curiosity satisfied. He pocketed the key and stood trying to decide where to sleep. The mow on a night that hot would be stifling. In the milk house, he found a pile of burlap sacks, then walked into the field. It was full dark by that time, but the faint reach of the yard light cast his shadow before him. At the narrow end of the trees by the whale rock, he snapped the dust from the sacks and threw them down. Essay circled and circled, solving again the everlasting riddle of lying down to sleep. She came to rest with her back to him, muzzle fitted high on her foreleg. Overhead the aurora flew, sheets of wild neon. He focused on the hovering seed of the yard light flickering through the hay and breathed the scent of pollen and decay that infused the night. They'd slept for some time when the truck crested the hill. The moon was up, the field around them like salt and silver. He sat on the burlap and watched the truck back around and stop by the porch while the kennel dogs barked a frantic greeting. Essay stood and whined. Edgar lay a hand on her hip. She nosed him and turned back to watch. The truck disgorged the figures of Claude and his mother. Claude lifted the gate on the topper and lifted out 2 bags of groceries while his mother paused to settle the dogs. The porch door creaked and slapped. The kitchen light appeared dimly through the broad windows in the living room. Twice more Claude walked between the back porch and the truck. On his last trip, he stood looking around the yard, then closed the topper and walked to the porch and turned out the light. And sitting under the stars in the sky, Edgar waited to see Almondine. She had not jumped down from the bed of the truck. He had watched for that. "I just missed her," he said to himself. He closed his eyes to see it again, but she would have scented him at once. He felt himself perfectly drawn and repelled, wishing to be done with that part of his life, and wishing never to let it end, knowing that whatever came next would only reduce what had already happened until there was nothing but memory, a story eroded, a dream thinly recalled. If she wasn't at home, she must have gone into town with them. It was one or the other. One or the other. He looked at the stand of birches alone in the center of the field. It was the middle of August when he stood, the timothy almost reached his waist. He stumbled through it, striking at the heads with his splayed hands. The trunks of the birches tilted and blurred, and the leaves in their canopy quavered whitely. Then he was standing in the broad circle of grass skied away at the base of the trees. There was the familiar white cross for the stillborn baby, and the newer one for his father. And next to them, as yet unmarked, an oblong of fresh dark ground. It blew the breath out of him. It felt like a puppet severed from he felt like a puppet severed from its strings. He lay with his forehead pressed to the ground, the scent of iron and loam filling his nostrils, and he clutched the dirt and poured it out of his hands. An oceanic roar filled his head. All his memory, all his past, rose up to engulf him. Images of Almondine, how she liked peanut butter but not peanuts, how she preferred lima beans to corn but refused peas, how best of all she adored honey any way she could get it, licked from his fingers, from his lips, dabbed on her nose, how she liked to snatch things from his hand and let him take them back, how if he cupped her chin, she would lower and lower her head all the way to the ground to stay like that. How different it was to stroke her with the palm than with his fingertips. How he could lay a hand on her side while she slept and she wouldn't open her eyes, but nonetheless understood. And her breath came differently. He remembered a time when he was small. Oh, friends. He remembered a time when he was small, when Almondine was young and rambunctious, more like a wild horse than a dog to him. She'd cross the yard faster than a swallow and catch him running across that same field. He liked to sneak away, make her chase, see her fly. When she reached him, they would turn and sprint into the field, heading for a thicket of raspberry canes, a place he liked simply because he was small enough to move through it unscathed. But when they arrived, something was standing there. An animal he had never seen before, with a broad face and pointed nose and great smooth black claws. They'd run up quickly and surprised it, and it turned to face them with a hoarse cough, hissing and slashing the ground, mistaking their headlong rush for a charge. Gouts of dirt sprayed the air behind its haunches. He tried to step back, but the thing bounded equally forward, tethered to him by some unseen force. Panting throatily and turning and snapping at its hind legs and whirling to face them again, a bearded gray foam lining its jaw. How long Almondine stood beside him, he didn't know, transfixed by how this thing crabbed forward with each step back he took. Then she glided lengthwise between them, blocking his view and hipping him so hard he nearly fell. She didn't run to do it, used none of the enchantments of play, nothing clever, no dancing grace. She just stepped between them and stood, tail unlashed. Then she turned and licked his face, and he was stunned at what he understood her to be doing. If she moved, she exposed him, and therefore she would not move. She was asking him to leave, saying it was he who could save her, not the other way around. She would not even risk a fight with the thing. She would leave only if he were gone, and in such a way that it wouldn't chase. She took her eyes off it just that one instant to make things clear. He watched her standing there for the longest time as he backed away. When he reached the barn, she crouched and sprang and materialized at his side, and he remembered how they'd seen the thing dead and fly-strewn on the road the next day. There was Almondine playing their crib game, dancing for him, light as a dust mote. He thought of his father standing in the barn doorway, peering skyward as a thunderstorm approached, while his mother shouted, "Gar, get indoors, for heaven's sakes." That was how it was sometimes. You put yourself in front of the thing, waited for whatever was going to happen, and that was all. It scared you, and it didn't matter. You stood and faced it. There was no outwitting anything. When Almondine had been playful, she had been playful in the fact of that knowledge, as defiant as before the rabid thing. It was not a morbid thought, just the world as it existed. Sometimes you looked the thing in the eye and it turned away, and sometimes it didn't. Essay might have been taken up in the whirlwind of the lake, but she wasn't. There was nothing special in that except her certainty that she had driven the thing away. Sorry. In the morning, he planned to walk into the house. He didn't know what would happen then. Claude had been the one to find his note. He understood that. If his mother had read it, she would have run out shouting his name. But the house was dark, and no one had run out. He rested a hand on Essay's back, and they watched the yard. He felt hollow as a gourd. He knew he wouldn't sleep any more that night. The yard light stood high and brilliant on its pole above the orchard, its glow enveloping the house and yard, and all beyond the darkness and the sky black above. After a while, Claude stepped from the porch and walked along the driveway. A stripe of light appeared beneath the black barn doors. In a few minutes, the stripe winked out, and Claude crossed back to the house, mounted the porch steps, and without a pause, was swallowed up by the shadows. Do you think I can get through this next chapter with you? Let's pray I can, because... yeah. This is called Trudy. Trudy lay in bed, half sleeping, thinking about the dogs, that peculiar note of agitation she'd heard in their voices when she'd first stepped out of the truck. Not frenzy, exactly, though something akin to it, and enough to make her stop and look around the yard. She had seen none of the usual causes for alarm, no deer poaching in the garden, no skunk scuttling in the shadows, no raccoon peering red-eyed from an apple tree. In fact, the moment she had signed quiet, the dogs had settled down. She decided it was just the lateness of their arrival or the spectacle of a full moon hovering in the treetops, but the edge in their voices nagged at her now. And maybe it nagged at Claude, too. As she was having these thoughts, he sat up and began to dress by the blue moon wash streaming through the window. "I'm going to go check on those pups," he whispered. "I'll go with you." "No, stay asleep, back before you know it." The spring on the porch gave an iron yawn, and then she was alone. The dogs, she suspected, weren't the only reason Claude had gotten up. He was, for reasons she didn't understand, embarrassed about his insomnia, reticent to the point of silence whenever she asked him in the mornings how long he had been awake. The first few times she'd woken to find him missing, she had stolen out to watch him pace the yard, hands in his pockets, head down, walking until the steady rhythm of step, step, step worked whatever it was out of him. But mostly it was rainy nights that plagued Claude. He'd sit on the porch drawing the tip of his pocket knife across a bar of soap until a facsimile of something or another appeared in his hands and was carved down into something smaller and then something smaller yet until it finally disappeared entirely. The crumbs and curls she found in the trash spoke most eloquently of how long he had sat in the dark. Trudy had her own reason for wanting to go outside. It would have been an opportunity, though belated, to stand beside the silo, to make her nightly signal that it was safe for Edgar to come home. But it had been late when they'd parked the truck and carried in the groceries, and full dark. Even so, she had found an inconspicuous reason to go out. She might have tried anyway. This arrangement between her and Edgar was one fact about the night in the mow she had kept secret from Claude, letting him believe, along with Glenn and everyone else, that Edgar had fled, panic-stricken at the sight of Paige lying so near where Gar had died. Why she'd withheld this fact from Claude when she told him so much of the rest, she couldn't have said, partly because she thought it would be such a short-lived deception. The very next night she'd walked into the tall grass and stood facing the sunset, expecting to see Edgar emerge from the woods as Gar had, so long ago, shimmering into place between the aspens. Finally, afraid that Claude would ask what she was doing, she had walked to the house, ignoring the whisper that said Edgar was there, watching but choosing not to believe her. So it had gone the next evening, and all the evenings after that. What had possessed her to tell Edgar to leave? Almost instantly she had realized it was unnecessary and foolish, but by then he had disappeared. Standing behind the silo had become her daily penance for that mistake. Though one that did nothing to ease her mind, her only consolation was that the dogs who'd followed Edgar had never turned up, which meant they were still out there, which meant he was safe. She drew a ragged breath thinking of it. He was all that remained of her family. And he was somewhere. But sometimes Trudy couldn't help imagining that Edgar had returned just once on an evening when she'd found no excuse to be outside and he'd lost hope and set off for good. What came into her mind at those times was the image of a black seed, grown now into a vine with stems and leaves of perfect black, an image from those days long ago that followed her last miscarriage. The night was hot. Her thoughts had begun to drift on a plane between reverie and sleep, circling, eddying. She gave herself over to them, a lucid passenger in her own mind. She and Gar had been so certain everything was okay with the pregnancy. Afterward, there had been in her a void, a raw sunlight scraped center, something atrocious that muttered how simple it would be to fall down the stairs, to find a quiet place on the river and walk in. Eating had been like pouring sand into her mouth. Sleep, a suffocation. Relief came only when she turned inward and embraced that place. The decision was indulgent and self-pitying, yes, but time passed there in such a soothing contraction. When she opened her eyes, it was morning. Gar was holding a cup of coffee for her, and when he walked away, she closed her eyes, and then it was another morning, and the day had passed. Each hour spent like that poisoned her, she thought, yet the sensation was irresistible, enthralling. Equal parts dread and desire. She roused herself finally out of a perversely selfish concern for Gar, because a retreat to that black center would provide her no peace if he were dragged down too. She'd forced herself out of bed and gone downstairs. Gar had been almost giddy. He had left her alone on the porch and returned cradling that feral pup. She chilled it, barely drew breath, black and gray and brown in his hands, eyes glittering, feet scuffling along against his palm. And that was the first thing to move her. I think I have more tissue, or at least napkins. A couple, which will be helpful. Okay, we can do this. And that was the first thing to move her, the first tangible thing since the stillbirth. From the moment she touched the nursling, she had known it wouldn't survive, but just as certainly had known they would have to try. The crib had been ready for weeks. Live or die, she wanted the pup to decide there, for those preparations to have some purpose. When Almondine woke her in the night, she leaned over the wooden rails and carried the pup to the rocking chair and set it in the folds of her robe. She'd rocked and watched that pup. Did it have its own black place, she wondered? It wasn't injured. Could it simply choose to live? And if it wanted to die, why did it struggle so? She traced the tines of its ribs, the pin feather fur of its belly. Somehow, a bargain was articulated between them. Trudy was unsure how that happened, only that it was so. Then the pup closed its eyes and gave a last, infinitesimal sigh. It was one thing to live in a world where death stood a distant figure, quite another to hold it in your hands. And Trudy had held it now twice within a month. She thought that night she'd made a pact with death itself. She could stay if she allowed death to stay as well. In choosing life, she embraced contradiction. The night passed, and by the time Gar found them the next morning, a great swell of sorrow had risen in her and receded. And in its wake, the black place had been reduced to a grain. Afterward, she poured her life into the few of them that were there, into Gar, into Almondine, into the dogs and their training. She locked away that shriveled particle, ignoring and submerging it under feverish work. Years passed. Edgar was born. A never-ending mystery to all that. It seemed, except to the dogs. Trudy seldom thought about that night. She came to believe that the black place had left her, and to remember with the full force of her imagination would only call it back. She had been waiting after Gar's funeral. Oh, goodness. When the pneumonia was at its peak, that tiny seed appeared again in her sleep, its hole cracked. From the fissure, a thread sprouted, delicate as silk. It vanished like a skittish animal the next morning, but her deepest fever dreams were yet to come, and in them she coaxed that tendril out. It circled her hips, her waist, her breasts. It wove itself through her hair and across her face until it bound her up, every inch of it velvety black. A comfort at first. Then she woke one morning to discover the tendrils had become a cage. There was a moment of panic before she remembered how it worked, and then she drew a breath and turned toward it. She'd made some decision during that time that followed, bad decisions possibly. She had convinced herself that Edgar's resentment toward Claude would lessen. Now she wondered if that hadn't played a part in Edgar's staying away. She could not look directly at this thought, or the thought that Edgar might never return. Such things could be examined only in the periphery of her mind. Such were the contradictions she'd learned to live with. In July, Claude arranged placements for two of Edgar's litter, Opal and Umbra, the ones Edgar called the twins. But when the time came, Trudy balked, had grown hysterical. In fact, at any diminishment of her son's presence, the placements were canceled. To placate everyone, she agreed to let two pups go instead, something they had never done before. In the bedroom, Claude had returned, and he sat on the edge of the mattress unbuttoning his shirt. She sighed and turned away. For weeks after the pneumonia, she forced herself out to the kennel, pretending to be recovering. No, not pretending. She was recovering in her body. In the mornings, after Edgar boarded the school bus, the silence in the barn was intolerable. Playing music, even worse, Almondine found her and curled up, slept nearby, a comfort, but the bed called to her so strongly. The weight of her encumbrance was so great that by mid-morning most days she was in the house, exhausted and asleep. One day, just after noon, Claude and Paul appeared at the end of the driveway. Trudy watched from the porch as he swung open the barn door and walked inside. She sat in the living room and waited, and finally she went to the barn. She found him weighing a pup and making notes. He looked at her but said nothing. That entire first week passed almost wordlessly between them, except for small questions. Immediate problems. Trudy didn't welcome Claude's presence, and she couldn't hide that. She wanted to ask him to leave, but she knew she needed the help. Each day before Edgar came home, Claude got into his car and drove off, sometimes with no more than a sidelong goodbye. Twice, when she looked up, he was simply gone. That Saturday, when Claude didn't show up, all she felt was relief. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, she found herself looking out the window. The Impala appeared again late Monday morning. Trudy lay in bed, unable to rouse herself. Then anger. What was it he wanted? Silent or not, Claude kept coming for a reason, but she needed to be left alone. What little energy she could muster was spent stumbling through the chores and looking after Edgar. She stalked to the barn. Claude was kneeling on the floor of the medicine room. The drawers and cabinets all stood open. Vials of pills and stainless steel scissors and packages of gauze and bottles of Physahex and betadine. surrounded him. She intended to ask him to leave, but instead blurted out a question. Just tell me this. Do you miss him? Claude stood and looked at her and licked his lips and took a breath, deep enough to make his shoulders rise. No, he said. And then, after a pause, I remember him. I remember him just like he was. Whew. She had expected a lie. She hoped for that. It would make it easier to tell Claude to leave. But he spoke in the words as an offering, a gift of some kind, a reparation. And in the silence that followed, she thought he might even apologize for his answer. That would be false too, but he simply waited. His posture and the look in his eyes said he would go if she asked. She still didn't understand what he was doing, but he wasn't trying to force his presence on her. He was coming, she thought, for some purpose of his own, to assuage some memory or feeling connected with Gar, or maybe he was making amends for not grieving his brother's death. If you're going to keep coming out, you could at least ask me what needs to be done, she said. What then? The first thing that came to mind was that the medicine room was a disaster, that it needed to be thoroughly cleaned, the expired medicines discarded, reorganized, but they were standing in the middle of it, and he was already engaged in exactly that. One of Alice's tires went flat over the winter, she said. All right, what else? Nothing. Everything. Leave the pens in the morning, he said. I'll clean them when I run out. What happened was this. When Trudy felt most vulnerable, she had seen in Claude a chance to anchor herself, to stop the backward slide that alone she could not check. She asked him to recall something of Gar. What do you want to know? Anything. Tell me the first thing you remember about him, your earliest memory. His eyes fluttered briefly, and he looked away. You might not like it, he said. I knew a different Gar than you. That's okay, she said. Just tell me. But inside she thought, I hope so. If you knew the same Gar, we're both lost. If you really want to know, what I remember is a snowstorm, he said. The start of a blizzard, the first one I'd ever seen. I couldn't have been more than 3 years old because seeing that much snow falling was a shock. We were standing in the living room, looking out the window across the backyard, down the field, and everything began to disappear. First the trees at the bottom of the field, and then the whole field, and then even the barn. I got the idea that the world had changed forever. It got me so excited I wanted to go outside, and I remember wanting to see how many snowflakes I could grab in my hand. Whether I could follow one of them all the way down to the ground and see it land. I wanted to taste one. I didn't understand that it would be cold, and I couldn't see why Gar stopped me. Except now that I think about it, he didn't care about the cold. What he cared was that no one put tracks in the snow, she whispered. Claude looked surprised and nodded. That's right. He told me how if we waited until morning we'd wake up and be amazed. The truck would have disappeared, the barn would be an igloo, but only if we didn't trample the snow while it was falling. But I'd latched onto the idea that something tremendous was happening, that some force had been let loose, and by morning it would all be back to normal. And I started to run, and the next thing I know, he's standing between me and the kitchen door, pushing me back and yelling. Yeah, she thought, all those thunderstorms and Gar standing in the doorway of the barn, watching the sky. A knot inside her relaxed. Claude hadn't known a different Gar, just a younger one. She laughed. Unbelievably, she laughed. Later she cried, of course, the way a person cries when a salve is finally applied to a burn. But most miraculous of all, she had rested that night for the first time since Gar had died. The next day she called to Claude from the porch door and poured him coffee. She asked whether they had ended up going out into the snow after all, or had they waited until morning. She felt she was treading some dangerous ground, and that if she pulled too hard, and that was her instinct, to seize the thread of story Claude had offered and yank it with all her might, it would silence him. A seduction of sorts began. Yeah, sexual. He wanted that more than she, but she wasn't unwilling. They weren't exactly trading one thing for another, true. Sometimes when she ran out of questions, she found herself leading him into the bedroom, and there was always an element of gratitude about the act. But there was selfishness as well, and at night she slept. She blissfully slept. The irony was, the more Claude's memories of Gar released her from the haunting she felt, the more they'd occupied Claude. By listening to his stories, Trudy was finally able to say goodbye. Goodbye to the young Gar, the teenage Gar. The Gar she'd never known, but had somehow expected to know. Claude spoke about his older brother in a clear-eyed, unsentimental tone. She learned things that only a brother could know, particularly a younger brother who had grown up in Gar's shadow, studying him, copying him, worshipping him, and fighting horrendously with him. How could she explain any of that to Edgar? How could she say that she needed Claude because Claude knew Gar and wasn't destroyed by his death? How could she say that when she missed Gar most, she talked to Claude? And he told her stories, and for a moment she really remembered that Gar had existed. How could she explain that she could get out of bed in the morning if there was a chance she might touch Gar again? And slowly, she learned about Claude, the great distractor. He took an almost malevolent pleasure in tempting the dogs while she trained them. One day, when she was proofing recalls, he walked across the yard with a cardboard box filled with squirrels. Not that she knew it at the time. And when the dogs had crossed halfway to her, he yanked open a flap and 3 gray streaks shot across the lawn. The dogs had wheeled and chased. "Okay," she said, laughing. "How did you do that?" "Ah, ancient Chinese secret," he said. Claude's gift, if that's what it could be called, was all the more baffling for its effortlessness. He seemed to know every human reaction within a day's drive. Unsolicited, people bore news to him of celebrations, large or small. Everything from the feed mill codger's plan to sample the diner's new meatloaf to baseball games and back alley fights. That very evening they had set out to buy groceries in Park City and ended up at all things a wedding reception in someone's backyard. The friend of a cousin of a man Claude had once met at the Hollow. Just for an hour, Claude had promised, though it had been close to midnight when they'd driven home. As an orphan handed from relation to relation a half-dozen times before she was 12, Trudy could wield an insular self-reliance. But how could she not be charmed when a group of near strangers welcomed them? People she'd lived among for all these years but had never met. How could that be? Comparing Claude and Gar was a bad idea, she knew, but in this way they were such opposites. Gar had, if anything, repelled commotion, even happy commotion, in favor of a passionate orderliness. Those breeding records, so many drawers overflowing with log sheets, photographs, notes, pedigrees, Gar loved them. He believed as fervently in the power of breeding as she believed in training, that there was nothing in a dog's character that couldn't be adapted to useful work. Not changed, but accommodated, ultimately transformed. That was what people didn't understand unless they had worked long and hard at it. Most people thought training meant forcing their will on a dog, or that training required some magical gift. But ideas were wrong. Real training meant watching, listening, diverting a dog's exuberance, not suppressing it. You couldn't change a river into a sea, but you could trace a new channel for it to follow. This was a debate she and Gar had cheerfully never resolved. Gar claimed her training successes proved that its records, properly interpreted, brought each new generation of pups closer to some ideal, even if he could not put that ideal into words. Trudy knew better. The training had, if anything, gotten more difficult over the years, but Claude paid those files scant attention. To him, they were nothing more than a means to an end. He was more interested in catching the eye of the Carruthers catalog people after the branch kennel arrangement fell through with Benson, the man from Texas, who'd witnessed enough the night with Edgar, who witnessed enough the night Edgar had run to be apprehensive instead of enthusiastic. Perhaps the diversions were no accident. Whenever she began to brood, Claude practically leapt to draw her away toward wine and music, things immediate and uncomplicated. A movie in Ashland, backroad drives through bosky glades. A walk by the falls where the Bad River crashed through the granite sluices with an engulfing roar. She'd given in to the last idea more than once, standing at the footbridge across the gray chasm. He had produced a flask of brandy, and they'd watched the water clench its fist in the air and drop away. After he had taken a few turns at the brandy, he had murmured, "Mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion, through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean." He moved the old record player from the workshop to the house. He loved music of any kind, big band, Elvis, the Rolling Stones. Only classical music bored him with its orderly sterility. Most especially, he adored voices, crying, pleading, laughing voices, and the great melodious singers were his favorites. Whether they radiated unrestrained longing or sultry indifference, he liked Frank Sinatra for his brute power. He liked Edie Gourmet for her bright untouchability. Blame It on the Bossa Nova got him ridiculously worked up. But he held a special fondness for crooners, Perry Como, for example, or Mel Torme, who Trudy despised. Whenever Claude dropped the needle on a Mel Torme record, he'd announce in a hushed voice, "It's the Velvet Frog. I mean fog." And give Trudy a wide-eyed stare as if they found themselves trapped in a scene from a horror movie. But that was Claude, tricking her into laughing precisely because she resisted. It made her a little angry, though she ended up wishing he'd do it again, like a girl clapping and crying out for the magician to release another dove from his sleeve. Only with Claude, the dove seemed to come from inside her. She was in the twilight of quarter consciousness when notions crack and drift like floes of ice. Claude lay behind her, solid, heavy, hot. She was glad he had checked the kennel. The first news she would have to give Edgar was of Almondine. How vulnerable he would be to it. She must call Glenn Papineau tomorrow. If there'd been news, he would have driven out to tell them in person. And she had to be careful. Every time she asked, she chanced making the connection between Edgar and Paige's accident stronger in Glenn's mind. I think we could do one more chapter. It's back to Edgar. He sat by Almondine's grave and looked at the house and the oversized barn, wondering if everything that was happening was by dint of his own imagination, though he knew it wasn't so, just as he'd known well enough that night in the rain what was real and what was not. He thought about the first night Claude had stayed with them, how he and Almondine had snuck into the barn, and how they found Claude asleep in the mow, but not really asleep, looking up into the rafters. "This is just how I remembered it," he said. "Your dad and I knew every nook and cranny. We hid cigarettes up here, liquor even. The old man knew it was up there. It was there somewhere, but he was too proud to look for it." One time they'd opened up a wall in the house and discovered Schultz's writing inside. And once Edgar had found a loose section of floorboard near the front of the mow that lifted away. Beneath it lay a space big enough for a pack of cigarettes and a flask of whiskey. The only contents had been a lace of cobwebs and a bottle cap, and at the time he had thought nothing of it. A bottle cap. Someone had once hidden a bottle there. "My grandma's like me. Want to know what my grandma says?" He tried to remember if he'd ever looked under that board since the first strange conversation with Claude. "Do you think you can find that bottle?" "You need to look for that bottle unless you can lay hands on it. You need to go. That's what's in the juice." He stood. The moon had risen late, haloed and dimming the nearby stars. Essie had trotted off exploring in the moonlit field, but now he couldn't see her and he began to walk. When he neared the kennel, 2 dogs began to bay. The noise didn't worry him so long as it was brief. He even felt a kind of dark thrill knowing that night it wasn't a deer wandering through the orchard that started them or an owl dropping onto a rabbit in the long grass. He opened the rear kennel doors. A rectangle of moonlight skewed across the aisle and his shadow in it. Before he'd run off, he could have walked into the barn in the dead of night and the dogs wouldn't have uttered a sound. But they were on the verge of an uproar now. He groped his way to the medicine room, felt his irises shrink when he flicked the light switch up. He went down the line, crouching in front of their pens and touching them, looking at the catch lights in their eyes. and signing, "Quiet." When they were calm, he found a flashlight in the workshop and extinguished the light in the medicine room. He stood at the back doors looking for Essie, but she was nowhere to be seen, and he pulled the doors shut. In the dark, he heard a dull electromechanical buzz. He shined the flashlight beam up the aisle until it stopped on a telephone mounted on one of the thick posts. They'd put an extension in the barn, but the crosstalk ring was the same as ever. He lifted the receiver to his ear. Beneath the dial tone, a faint conversation, two strange voices, a man and a woman. He walked to the workshop and climbed the steps, forcing himself past the spot where Dr. Papineau had lain. The mow still trapped the day's heat. The rear third was stacked with fresh straw, bales all the way to the trusses. The smell would have been lovely under different circumstances. It reminded him of all the time he had spent there. Bales shoved into makeshift corrals, rolling pups until their hind legs kicked, teaching them to sit for the slicker brush and the nail clippers, or paging through the dictionary for names. He started searching near the vestibule doorway, swinging the beam of the flashlight in downward angled arcs and kicking straw aside until near the far front corner he spotted the stub of board he had in mind. One edge had been splintered by a screwdriver or knife, and he squatted and flicked open Henry's jackknife and wedged the blade into the slot before he noticed the nails at either end and the hammer strikes in the wood. He found a pry bar in the workshop. The board tipped up a quarter-inch before the old wood gave way and the pry bar popped free. It was enough to raise the nail heads. The hollow beneath the board was just as he had remembered, a few inches of clear space floored by one of the broad main timbers into which a dugout had been chiseled, and as empty as when he had first discovered it. But the bottle cap and the cobwebs were absent. And there was another difference. A fresh set of chisel marks widened a stretch of the original cavity by half an inch or more on each side. Unlike the older, carefully made depression whose surfaces were smooth and straight with edges straight, the new indents looked chewed into the timber. He ran his fingers along the splinters. A few amber wood chips lay scattered across the old beam. He tried to remember how that bottle had looked, clasped between him and Ida Payne. The stopper, a crude blob of glass, the ribbon with its indecipherable lettering, the oily contents licking the insides. He looked at his palm, measured the sensation of it against the chiseled marks. He sat back and shone his flashlight against the staggering yellow wall of bales. Chaff drifted through the light. With the barn broom, he swept the straw back from the front floor across the floor, tapping at boards, dozens of hiding places. Claude had said Edgar could work until sunrise and still not test them all. The dogs in the back runs let out a volley of barks. He cracked open the mow door and looked down to find Essie trotting past. He ran down the mow stairs and opened the back doors and clapped for her until she trotted up from the dark. Then he led her to the pen with Finch and Pout and opened the door, and before he could sign anything, she walked in and the three of them settled into the straw. In the medicine room, he sloshed water around a coffee can and tossed the grit at the drain hole and refilled it and took a swallow and carried it back with him up to the mow. He tipped the board onto its slot unnailed and kicked the loose straw around until it didn't look swept. The batteries in the flashlight had begun to fail. He flicked it off and shook it and waited and pushed the thumb switch forward again. The filament came on yellow, then dimmed back to amber orange. It was enough light to climb the stacked bales by. Once on top, he wedged the flashlight into the crook of a rafter and wrestled bales around him until he created a hollow, and he settled in and switched off the flashlight. In the dark, the heat in the rafters congealed around him. He had to force himself to take a breath. After a long time, swallows began to trill from their nests in the eaves. The first cicadas cried out their complaint. Far away, the porch door creaked and two of the dogs called out. The doors on the front of the barn rattled as they were hooked up open. Then Claude's voice echoing through the kennel. Edgar wondered how long it would take before he discovered Essie. When light began to show through the cracks beneath the eaves, he tipped the coffee can to his mouth. The water tasted of iron and dust and blood. Finally he slept, but it was cursed sleep. Every sound jerked him awake. Chaff covered him like ash. With every movement came some new scratch or bite, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, not knowing what else to do besides wait. And with that, we're going to wait until the next recording. Guys, we're so close. I think we'll have 2 recordings left, unless we really plow through and I have a fresh box of tissue. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time on Gena's Book Nook.